Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Hello there, it's Zoe, and welcome to the show. This week on Planet Human, good news, yay! Scientist Dylan Liu is working on amazing technology called Nano Cellulose. It is making product cling wrap from food waste. So it kills a few birds with one stone. It helps take advantage of food waste and turn it into something useful while eliminating the need for terrible plastic packaging, which drives me absolutely insane in the supermarket when you get a bunch of vegetables that are packaged with plastic. So nanocellulose will help alleviate some of that stuff. The other cool feature of it is that because it's organic, it changes color as it comes into contact with food that is also changing state, i.e. rotting. So it can be a good indicator of when you should start to eat that food and not let it go off. So it saves you from the soggy, dried out carrots in the bottom of your fridge that you may not have noticed otherwise. So yeah, thank you, Dylan Liu, and your nanocellulose technology. So hopefully we'll get that out soon and progress with reducing food waste and plastic waste into the earth. On Planet Zoe, I'm in Broome this week. I'm working with the Kimberley Health Unit, working on their strategy, courtesy and organized by Outback Initiatives. A good friend of mine, Cheryl Fisher, operates Outback Initiatives, and I'm doing some work for her and the company over the next couple of months over in WA. And this is the first gig. And I am so lucky I get to work on the strategy with the Kimberley Health Unit people. Very important work up there in the top of WA. So very exciting. In the meantime, though, my question for you this week is, what does it take to lead and survive an extraordinarily long life of service? My guest today is none other than retired Commodore Peter Scott. Peter has been on the show previously, and I invited him back after he published his amazing book, his memoir called Running Deep, because I picked up the book and just powered through it. It is compelling reading. He's an excellent writer. The stories are edge of the seat, fingernail biting, really powerful, really personal, really revealing. And I thought, wow, that's extraordinary to show so much courage and vulnerability and open-heartedness. And I thought it was worth talking to him again some more about what it takes to lead in difficult circumstances and to have the courage to confront your own demons as well as the demons of the enemy that are out there working against us. All right. So without further ado, here is Peter. All the way from beautiful Sydney, welcome back to the show, Peter Scott.
Thanks, Zoe. Lovely to be back.
I was very thrilled to get a copy of your book, read it in a day and a half, just flat out, couldn't put it down. And I thought, oh my God, we only got such a tiny sliver of you and your stories on the last episode. So of course we had to have you back. And your book, Running Deep, is fantastic. Why did you choose to write the book?
A couple of reasons, Zoe. It's a memoir, of course, covers most of my naval career and particularly focuses on my submarine career. My career, as far as submarine careers go, there's nothing extraordinary about it in particular, but I'm quite conscious that for most Australians, living a submarine life is an exotic and just a largely unknowable way of life. It's hard to imagine what it might be like, and it's really easy to misunderstand what it is like. So I wanted to offer people something that would show them a little of what it's like to live that life, what it takes to do it, and ideally to do it well, but also what it means to be an Australian servicewoman or man, and in particular what it means to be an Australian submariner. I also wanted to invite, I think, a greater appreciation of the value of our submarines as a deterrent or as an offensive capability. So they're probably the the main reasons. There's an aspiration piece in there. I'd like to inspire further generations of submariners. But you've read the book, Zoe. You'll understand that I'll probably frighten a few more people off than I attract.
Well, I think it does take a particular type of person, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, to stump up and throw their hat in the ring and say, yes, I will put myself in harm's way in difficult circumstances for months on end. Not everybody wants to sign up for that. So is it a particular type of person, or is it something that you come around to eventually and adapt to, do you think?
Perhaps a little bit of both. Most submariners join the Navy ahead of actually volunteering for submarines. So, there's something driving them into a life of service, and there's something appealing to them in that regard, typically. Whether or not they make that leap into that extra dimension of serving in submarines is probably perhaps those who are looking for just that little more challenge or the little more adventure. I've, having sort of thought through it all now, pretty clear on what attracted me, the sense of purpose with the submarines, the challenge. There was just challenge ahead of you at every level, but also the people that you got to work with, just tremendous people, service-oriented and purpose-driven people. So they were the things that attracted me to submarines for all those years.
And you joined fairly young, and I'm curious about the weighting of those reasons to join: purpose, challenge, and people. You were 17 or 18? 17.
17 when I joined the Navy, yeah. 17.
Was purpose really the leading reason, or was it the challenge of the people? Can you reflect on that at all? And did the balance of those reasons change over time?
Yeah, I'd say at that time, the thing that was driving me most was a sense of adventure, wanting to get out and explore the world in some way. I think I probably chose to do that, in an organisation like the Navy, because I'd been brought up with very strong, service and community-minded and family-minded values. And so it wasn't a giant leap to go off and join the Navy as opposed to going off to be a banker or a lawyer or something else. But I think the crystallisation of purpose came over time when I got to better understand what it was that, the Navy actually does and what something like the submarine service actually does.
Thank you for sharing that, because I was really curious about that. There's a motif or a myth about, yes, I'm going to sign up and serve my country. And I'm always thinking about that. When people join at 17, what do you know about the world and the universe? How could it really be the lead factor? And perhaps it is for some, but it makes more sense to me, knowing teenagers and reflecting on my own life, that adventure would be the lead calling. And then as you stay, it's like, actually, this is kind of purposeful. And to build up a rationale for all the sacrifices that you have to make in order to have that life. And there are an extraordinary number of sacrifices that are undertaken.
There are. Naval life involves professional challenge. It involves separation from family and friends, particularly in something like submarines. That separation can actually be quite profound. Isolation. Life on board a warship is not typically comfortable or luxurious, and life on board a submarine is certainly neither of those things. So you do put up with some discomfort and some disadvantage. And, you make calls along the way as to whether or not the satisfaction that you're drawing from the work is matching that discomfort or inconvenience.
Absolutely. It's interesting reflecting on a memoir. As a memoir does not tell you the whole story. And as an author, you have to make selections about what goes into the book. And I was really curious about the incredible amount of vulnerability that is in this book. And starting from the very first action-packed scene, which we didn't mention at all in the last interview, I'm like, oh my goodness. And the opening scene, no spoilers here, is the submarine that you're leading is got a flood, and it's going down to the bottom of the ocean if things don't get rectified pretty quickly, and it's looking pretty grim. And I'm like, it's like probably if you're going to go down to the bottom of the sea with a flooding submarine. I can imagine that's probably one of the really bad scenarios. And you start there. And then it's flashing back to the early part of your childhood where you share that you were an older child who had a bedwetting problem. Like, wow, as a very senior military leader, to put something like that, and there's other instances throughout the book, into the book. Why did you choose to go down such a vulnerable path in sharing these stories?
Yeah. So, writing a memoir, as you've sort of indicated, is a very reflective process, Zoe. And I went to a lot of trouble to replace myself, back in my childhood or back in my 20s or in that submarine, wherever it might be, so that I could not only sort of re-experience, but really relive those times, but also place them in context of what was going on around me at the time, what was impacting me at the time, and then place them in perspective, through a life. And having sort of done a lot of that work, I was then able to select stories that would carry some meaning for the reader. And a lot of stories were in there initially, and I realised they had meaning for me, but I didn't have a useful meaning for the reader in them, so they kind of went. So, for example, that example that you gave, I think that tells the reader something about how I viewed myself as a young person, and you can see in different ways how that carried through other parts of my life over time. So I thought it was worth sharing. And you can look at something like that, and sometimes the first thing that occurs to you is it's an admittance. It's like there's a guilt associated with it or something, and you're having to admit that you were a bedwetter. What I actually found, probably in the years before, but certainly in writing the book, was I developed a great sense of acceptance of who I was at different times of my life. And when you can accept, you might not like who you were. There might be guilt, there might be regret associated with who you were at a certain time in your life. But when you can accept that that's who you were, then it's less of an admission and it's more something useful that you can offer the reader.
That was certainly my sense of reading the book. It didn't feel like an admission or a confession. It was actually a very open-hearted, this was what happened to me, this is the choices I made, and these were the repercussions and all the ugly bits and positive bits that came along with that. So I found it quite a balanced expose, I guess.
Great. Yeah, somewhere along the line, I decided that if I was going to write a book and offer people something, I was not going to write half a book. I wasn't going to offer a unidimensional view of service life. It was never going to be a glossy brochure. I wanted it to be a complete experience for people.
And I think this is what marks the difference in your memoir, a military leadership memoir, which I've read lots of them because I've interviewed several military leaders on the show. And I quite have a fascination for military life in extreme circumstances, is how down to earth and we already said it wasn't confessional, how open-hearted it was about the challenges. And because other military leaders would slice off that part of it and just say, these were the difficult choices I made in leadership, and here's the leadership lesson, and rah, and here's the exemplary way to lead. And your memoir is not that. It is not rah, this is how you lead, and this is the definitive path to leadership. It's more about, I'm a human, and this is the challenges I face, these are the triumphs, and these were definitely the downfalls. Did you have to think about that, comparing the kinds of style of military memoirs that are out there?
Yeah, I knew what I did not want to write. I did not want to write a lecture on leadership. There are definitely some themes that run through the book on survival and resilience and leadership, but I never wanted to write a lecture on any of those things. There's lessons on leadership for those who want to dig through the book and read them, but maybe that comes later. But it wasn't the purpose of writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about alcohol. And alcohol makes an early appearance in the book and in your life and stays for a good long time in different guises. What was that like to write about your relationship and reliance on alcohol?
It was difficult at times, just because I was recalling some of the situations I'd put myself in, and some of the times when I really put at risk things like my health, my family, my career. So it was difficult in that regard. But again, I accept that I think I say in the book somewhere, alcohol is not my friend, and it probably never will be. So it doesn't mean that today I don't have a couple of drinks every now and again, but I've got a very wary relationship with alcohol now, because I've seen that it can take control of me pretty quickly in the past. Now, how did it get to that point? Started off as any young Australian might do in the sort of early to mid-'80s, having a couple of beers. There was a pretty heavy drinking culture in parts of Navy. There was certainly a heavy drinking culture in the submarine squadron when I joined. And it was probably the go-to coping mechanism for forming friendships, for coping with stress and anxiety. And, that just got carried away with me. I was at times pretty competitive, and, I'd take it on as a bit of a challenge to outdrink pretty much any drinking comrade / competitor. So it certainly got out of control and out of hand. It's one of those things where I eventually decided I needed to seek professional help to get a handle on it. And again, I'd say that didn't fix me in that regard, but it certainly marked a point in time where I was able to say, okay, you're not in control here. You need to deal with this and find other ways, better ways to cope with stress, fear, loneliness, whatever it is that you need to cope with.
I think this is a big challenge. I mean, drinking culture in, first of all, Australia, and then in the military, when you are under such extreme peril, difficult conditions, it seems like it's an easy legal choice to make in terms of numbing the after effects of being in those circumstances. What is it like these days? Is there much support and skill making to help young service people cope with the stresses?
Yeah, I would make the point that the Navy of today is quite a different Navy in many respects than the Navy that I joined, and probably much better off in that regard, with regard to less of a drinking culture and so on, more support available by way of, psychologists and so on. So I think it, never takes away from the individual's responsibility to look after their own health and so on. But organisationally, I think we're in a much better place just culturally across the Navy these days than we were 30 or 40 years ago.
I think there's more awareness of PTSD, the effect on service people, and the appalling rates of suicide of ex-servicemen and women, and that we need to do something about that. If we're going to send our young people off to war and in difficult circumstances, we can't just let them flounder when they land back in Australia in civilian life. And that's a big issue. So I'm glad to hear that things have changed a little bit. I want to ask you, because it really struck me. This is one of the stories you put in the book. I'm like, wow, I'm channeling, you are a very senior naval officer with a distinguished career. I mean, you said it was not unusual, but I beg to differ. You've been in lots of places and you've had lots of senior roles as well as some junior ones. Tell us about Horatio.
Horatio is described in the book, I think, as my stuffy but fiercely loyal friend. Horatio was a teddy bear that my wife gave me. We're not yet married, but I was heading off to sea shortly after we met. And I kind of knew that it wasn't the done thing for grown men and naval officers to take their teddy bear to sea, but I felt compelled. And Horatio was eventually with me for, every posting to sea over a 30-plus year career. Horatio was a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a few little stories in there about he was often, not often, but occasionally subject to kidnap and ransom on board if people discovered he was there. But really, Horatio is in there as a character for a little bit of light relief, but also because, beyond those earlier themes, Zoe, of survival and resilience and leadership, I think there's a more central theme to the book, and that's connection. And, Horatio kind of symbolises that connection with home. But a lot of the book, in its own way, is about the personal and the professional connections we make, the relationships that we form with people, why we form them and how we go about that. A lot of it is about what we give to our relationships and what we take. A lot of it is about how we can hold on to connection, even, over time or at a distance, perhaps at depth. So, yeah, that's something that it took me a little while to realise in how many layers of the book that actually carried through, but it's a pretty important theme. And in fact, even sort of beyond the book, the Governor-General was kind enough to write a foreword for me. And he makes comment in there about emotional connection and emotional attachment between Australians and their servicemen and women. And I reckon at its simplest, if the book just offers an opportunity to strengthen that emotional connection between the Australian population and the submariners who go out and serve in their name, then that'd be a worthwhile outcome from writing the book.
Oh, it's heartbreaking and heartwarming, your entire story. And Horatio was much like that for me. I'm like, here is an adult sailor, submariner, going to sea with his teddy. And that requires A, vulnerability to do that, and B, vulnerability to talk about it. And sure, yeah, it's funny. Yeah, you have a teddy bear and people ransom it, but they get it. I'm guessing that your colleagues and peers would get that this is a connection from your girlfriend who became your wife and the family that you left behind. And I'm guessing, I'm not sure how many submariners take teddies to sea, whether you were unique or whether there was equivalent for other people around there. What kinds of things did you see that helped service people remain connected?
Not many took teddy bears to sea, I can tell you that. Look, I used to do it in different ways. I always had a little photo album at sea. Many of the years that I was at sea, we'd communicate by letter. It was about the only way we could back in those days. Even, more recently, the submarines don't typically have access to email and so on. So you can be very isolated out there. Part of it is learning to just tolerate and become comfortable with that lack of direct connection and just hold faith in, the strength of your relationships. Or if they're not particularly strong, deal with that as well. So I think for me, there are probably two ways of dealing with it. One was to box things up a bit. I'd go to sea, you'd box a lot of your life up and put it away until you came back alongside. But also carving out the time and giving yourself that little bit of space and privacy to actually, stop and think about, the people that you care about and, maybe reminisce or whatever. And you don't have to do too much of that to, at least in your heart, hold a bit of connection over time.
One of the most heartbreaking scenes in the book is towards the end of your military career, and you describe driving back to Canberra after a weekend in Sydney. And this is when you were based in Canberra and you were doing the commute back to Sydney every weekend. And that's a tough gig. It's 3.5 hours on a Friday evening. You have Saturday, and then Sunday night you turn around and go home back to Canberra again, fleetingly saying hello to your wife and daughter. And in this scene, you're driving back and you're screaming and you run off the road. And I was like, oh my God, this is just heart-rending. Was that a turning point moment for you? Tell me a little bit about that, because you've been in the military for so long. And then it just reached this point where this incredible scene where you nearly killed yourself from the grief of it.
Yeah, I would say it was a turning point, yeah. at that stage, I was actually immensely satisfied with the role that I was doing, with the work that I was doing, with what we were achieving there. I was head of the submarine profession at the time. And so, I'd put up with that for a couple of years, that sort of ongoing separation. And it wasn't that it was just a couple of years there. It was on the back of, deployments to the Middle East, deployments on submarines and so on. So eventually you get to a point where you got to make a decision about what's most important in your life and how you want to live your life. And, I did not do anything immediately on the back of that, but I would point to that occasion as quite catalytic. And certainly after that, things had changed. The balance had swung.
The balance in terms of making a decision to leave the military.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess, did you feel like that decision was going to occur at some stage, or is that sort of hovering over any service person at some stage?
Well, you either leave in a box or you retire or resign at some stage. Yeah. So, and the more senior you get, the just realistically, the closer you are to a retirement or the end of your career. So I knew it was coming. I think Navy had plenty more work for me, but for a whole bunch of reasons, it was the right time for me to finish off that job, do the best work I could in that job, but then while I was doing that, start designing a bit more of my life beyond full-time Navy.
All right. And that must have been an interesting thought in itself. Let's design my own life as opposed to have a life that's more directed by the Navy.
Yeah. So part of my thinking for most of my time in the Navy was that whilst I was in, I'd be all in. But then once I left the Navy, that would be it. It would be over and I'd go and do something completely different. My wife actually challenged that at one stage and said, hey, this has been part of your life for 30 years now. Why do you want to cut it off at the neck? Why does it have to be that black and white? So that actually caused me to start thinking about, okay, well, if I was to stay in the reserves, what work would I want to do? What is it that I most enjoy about being in the Navy? How might I continue to provide that service in the reserves? And it was part of that thinking that led me to what I do now, which is work as an executive coach. And that's largely the work that I still do a little bit of back into Navy is coaching some of Navy's senior executives.
Wonderful. Speaking about conflict and politics, one of your deployments was to Iraq, and it was during the war, and it was pretty awful. And you talk about feeling bereft by the devastation and the violence there. Can you tell me, what's your reflection on the region? Do you have much hope for it? Why or why not?
So I certainly didn't have a whole lot of hope for it then. The Iraqi society was just for so long had been just brutalised by violence. And it was, as far as I could see, just a broken and disrupted society. So I think where I am on that now is at the time that I could make a difference, I made as much difference as I could. For me now, there's actually security and defence challenges that are closer to home and more relevant to Australia today. So, I personally choose to, focus my energy and efforts elsewhere. It's probably where I'm at today.
It's an interesting viewpoint. I mean, the whole premise and purpose of submarine life is to act as a primary deterrent for aggression against Australia. And so that would shape your concern about different hotspots around the world. How do you think we're faring at the moment? Are we well equipped at the moment to defend Australia against these nefarious potential threats?
I think we could be better equipped. Certainly on the submarine front, there's been no shortage of decisions made about submarine capability over the last 20 years, but they haven't actually materialised in any new submarines for us. I absolutely think that the decisions on the AUKUS-related decisions around the nuclear-powered submarine capability, which, had just been announced when we last spoke, Zoe, is absolutely the right direction to go. Australia, for my money, has always needed nuclear submarine capability. We just haven't had governments that were in a position to set that as the requirement. So, yeah, we could be better positioned than we are today in a number of respects.
Well, it just takes so darn long to build, don't they? We just need to get those things made.
Yeah. And, submarines or any other defence capability, it's the sort of capability that you need to continually invest in, because you don't know when, strategic threats are going to materialise. So it's a long-term game and a long-term investment required on a lot of different fronts.
All right. Peter, are you ready for the Fast Five?
You bet.
Okay. What is the future technology that you most want right now?
So I've often wished for what I call a command barometer. So something that would tell me how I am doing in command today. But you know what? I'm actually glad they've never invented one, because that's where you get the satisfaction is, from making judgments and, standing on your own 2 feet and holding that line yourself. So I think there are certain circumstances where you'd wish for it, a command barometer, but long term, probably better off without.
You can probably give yourself your own little star rating in your journal. Today I was 5-star, maybe just a 2-star.
Or 3.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually probably a really interesting point for anyone listening who's thinking about how do I evaluate my leadership or my command, is do a daily review and review your decisions and et cetera. Because over a period of months, as you review your decisions, you can see patterns and you start to understand how your brain works and where the gaps might be as well. Okay. Well, I like that command barometer. Number 2, what's the best tip you ever got for leadership?
So I reckon it is decide what you're going to do if you fail, and then do everything in your power to succeed. Because I think you have to think through what failure looks like in order to lead other people to success.
Okay, that's actually pretty profound. So this is before you take a decision or before you take a role, or in just as a general principle in any context?
Both, yeah. What does a really bad outcome look like? How do I avoid that? In contrast, what does a really good outcome look like? How do I assure that? If you know and understand what bad looks like, you've got an eye open to threat and risk. And if you've got an eye open to threat and risk, you can manage opportunity.
That's great. I like it. Thank you so much. Number 3, what's one problem in the workplace that you'd love to wave a magic wand and be fixed right now?
Yeah, just a personal problem, Zoe. I'm flat out delivering coaching and marketing my book at the moment, and I cannot keep up with my social media and capitalize on all that stuff. So it's a good problem to have.
Kidding me?
I just can't do it.
Of all the leadership challenges and workplace problems you picked, not keeping up with social media. Yeah, all right.
Fun of mine.
Okay, number 4, thumbs up or thumbs down? Who's a leader that's doing something right, or conversely, somebody who's doing something wrong out there right now?
Yeah, so thumbs up to a Polly, actually.
Woo, that never happens. Nobody gives politicians thumbs up.
So Luke Gosling is the member for Solomon in the Northern Territory, and he's recently established a Parliamentary Friends of AUKUS, co-chaired with Aaron Violi, who's another member. And it's set up now to play a lead role, just signalling that bipartisan support of the Australian government for all things AUKUS, which is going to be so crucial to the acquisition of the nuclear-powered submarine capability that I spoke to earlier. So thumbs up to Luke.
Yeah, very good. A thumbs down, or are you happy with your thumbs up?
Oh, just give thumbs up today.
Okay. You save your thumbs down for social media.
Yeah.
All right. Number 5, what is your favorite leadership book or podcast, aside from this one, of course?
Yep. Aside from this one, so a podcast called Deep Leadership, which is hosted by John Rennie. He's based in the US. It's a top 100 US UK podcast. John's a former United States Navy submariner, but he's also got extensive experience in corporate life and also runs his own manufacturing business. And he gets some great guests onto his podcast to talk all things leadership. So amongst the great guests, I was on there with him last week and really enjoyed the conversation. So Deep Leadership, John Rennie.
All right. Thanks for the recommendation. And that was the Fast 5. The Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast is proudly sponsored by the Amplifiers Academy. It is an online self-paced leadership development program that you can join at any time and progress at your pace. There are very short video lessons, great checklists and resources and recommendations and book summaries, all there to help boost your leadership thinking and abilities. We focus on leading strategy, leading culture, leading change, and leading performance. So if you want a go-to resource that can help boost your strategic abilities immediately, check us out, Amplifiers Academy, on the zoerouth.com website. See you there. All right, Peter, I want to ask you, circle a little bit back. Oh, I can't believe I just used that expression. I want to come back to something you said earlier, or maybe it was the story I raised. That is the opening of your book, where your submarine is flooding and you're going down to the bottom of the ocean. If you don't rectify it, it's game over for you and the crew. How did you manage to stay composed and work your way out of that?
It's a good question, because I know that externally I appeared calm. Internally, there was a lot going on. But I think that training and experience had a great deal to do with it. You know, I had been in very difficult situations, not dissimilar to that in the past, and I knew that, you know, with training and discipline and teamwork, you could find your way out of those situations. But also part of it was just honouring my responsibility to lead on the day, to, you know, stand accepting my own discomfort, holding my own fear, so that I could offer, you know, courage to those around me and, you know, demonstrate confidence in the submarine and confidence in their abilities as individuals and as a team. So there might be a couple of threads there, Zoe.
This, I mean, what a remarkable scenario. And it's one that you would have, I'm wondering, one that you would have rehearsed or practiced for or not?
Yeah. So, you know, there's a bunch of scenarios. There's, you know, if you have a flood on your submarine, you set fire to yourself, you have a hydraulic burst, you have an electrical failure, all of those things can ruin your day. So, yep. So, you know, we train and we drill and we rehearse such that at least the first reaction to those events is known and practiced, and you can get that out of the way to sort of stabilise the situation, hopefully a little bit, and then give yourself a bit of time to work through, understand exactly what's happened and exactly what you need to do to get back to a safe and known state and get back onto your mission. So rehearsed, yes. What I've also found is that, you know, no matter how complex or overlaid you try to make the scenarios that you deal with in a training situation, sometimes those real life situations just have an edge of chaos that you could never imagine or replicate, and you just got to be able to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's true of most emergencies. It's like, hang on, that wasn't in the scenario planning that we did. Oh, okay, right. towards the end of the book, you talk about getting support after you left the military to deal with the PTSD, essentially. And you have this beautiful metaphor which describes the crocodiles in the mangroves as the fears that stay with you from your time in the service. And that now that instead of just lurking below the surface, the sea's gone out a little bit and you can see them. They're still there, but you can see them now. How do these traumas show up for you every day, or is it indeed every day? And second part of that question, was the submarine flooding one of those crocodiles in the mangroves?
Yeah. So, first of all, just a minor correction. I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD. So I did have symptoms of PTSD, and I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. But yes, so a whole bunch of traumas that kind of impacted on my life unwittingly. And how do they show up today? I'd say they show up less frequently. They show up less intrusively, and they show up less impactfully. So, I can still recall a whole swag of traumatic or difficult circumstances, many of which are in the book. But what used to happen was that they would come to me all the time. The flood in particular was one. It would just, parts of it would occur to me at any hour of day or night. And very often when that happened, it came with, the sort of emotional and physiological response that I had at the time as well. So there's actually been a number of different times when I've sought, professional medical help for my mental health over time. The first was, we touched on with alcohol fairly early in my career. Later on, I suffered from anxiety and depression, and a change there was I was much more willing later to use Navy's services and kind of admit to the service that I was dealing with these issues. Obviously, people protect the confidentiality and so on. And then as I left Navy, I knew that I was still carrying some sort of risk that I had not adequately dealt with some of these traumatic incidents. And I didn't want to carry that beyond Navy. So I sought help again. And it was very helpful, but it was very difficult work over several months in the year that I got out.
It is. I mean, dealing with trauma like that after so many decades, very extreme circumstances that not everybody can relate to, I can imagine is a very difficult process to try and metabolize, essentially, because your body hangs on to that. So trying to process that would be very huge. And thank you so much for writing about it and for sharing that. I think that's a really powerful insight. Again, it comes back to what I said earlier. You could have written the rah, I'm a brilliant, strong leader and look at my career path. And yet you didn't. And you said your journey was unremarkable, and yet you've shared remarkably about the challenges that you faced as a leader and also what your fellow service people faced and are facing. So one of my final questions for you is messages for the book. Do you have a message for non-serving readers and leaders? And do you have a message for leaders in the military services now?
Sure. So I think for non-military folk who might be reading the book, the world we live in can be astonishingly beautiful. It can also be frighteningly ugly. And I'm grateful that, living in Australia, we tend to live in that astonishingly beautiful piece more often than not. But I think to assure that life that we enjoy and our future prosperity, we need to be willing to defend it. And, that's why, in part, I wrote the book to help people see and understand the sort of capabilities that you might need to deter coercion and aggression and defeat attacks if they were to come. So I think it's just an offering of what's out there what defence does for the nation and what it might need to do. Different message for serving military leaders. I don't think, in my experience, they need to be told by anyone to care for their people. They know that, they do that. But what I do see is that perhaps they need a reminder to take care of themselves occasionally. And I think, self-acceptance and self-compassion are vital enablers of sustained high performance and leadership.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Peter. Where can people get a hold of you and your book?
So I've got a website, Zoe. I keep it really simple, just all the W's, peterscott.au. The book's been published by Fremantle Press, so it's available in loads of bookstores, online as an ebook or audiobook. So wherever they buy their books, they can find Running Deep and have a read.
And it is extraordinary book. Highly recommended. If I could give 7 stars, I would have given it 7 stars. Loved it.
Thanks, Zoe.
Peter, you're welcome. And thank you. Thank you for your service over all the many long decades, everything that you committed and contributed to this nation and continue to do so, as well as to the individual reader and listener who can take some heart and inspiration from your story. I am so deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe.
Such a beautiful man, such a beautiful conversation. Honestly, I was welling up so many times during that interview. So lovely. So takeaways for today's interview. Self-compassion, being kind to yourself and looking after yourself. It's a perennial leadership insight. And I think coming from a man like Peter and all his experiences, this really rings true. So do look after yourself. You're no good to anyone if you're not around. So look after yourself. And I think the other key takeaway would be appreciate the military. Appreciate the military personnel who are out there every day putting themselves in harm's way in defense of our way of life and our beautiful country. All right. Well, tip of the week comes from my second book, Moments, Leadership When It Matters Most. And it occurred to me in reading Peter's book, Running Deep, that so much of his stories are crucibles that are vessels, as I say in the book on page 32, vessel that is heated to great temperatures to melt metals. That's literally what a crucible is. And it also means a trial ordeal by which a person is transformed. So just reading a little bit from Moments, the idea about crucibles and how we can make use of them is this. To emerge through a crucible stronger and better for it, there is one essential skill needed, the ability to craft a narrative about the experience. This is the ability to make sense of the senseless and be able to craft a story about the challenges we faced, how we met them, and how we become better individuals and better leaders as a result. And I think Peter did an extraordinary job of that in his book, Running Deep, that is inspiring, profound, and incredibly touching. So please get yourself a copy of Running Deep and enjoy. Up next on the show, we have a solo-sode, and I'm diving deep into reflections on conflict, how we can better make use of it. What is it? What drives it? And how we can come through it. In terms of what you can do next is pay it forward. Be nice to someone. If you like this episode, share it with other people. If you like the podcast, tell other people about it. If you like the podcast, email me, zoe@zoerouth.com. Post a picture on social media of where you're listening to. I'd love to find out more about what you're thinking about the show and how you're enjoying it. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.